There is an old coffee can bolted to the shelf above the fuel logs in the equipment shed at the north gate, and no one who has worked a full season on this preserve will put a hand on it. The can is full of wood ash mixed with rock salt and something gritty that I have never asked about. The lid is held on with a strip of red electrical tape that gets replaced every spring. Nobody remembers who started it. The seasonal hires laugh about it for the first 2 weeks, the way people laugh about anything they do not understand yet. And then one night they come in off a late patrol with their radio in their fist and their pulse going hard in their throat. And the next morning I find them standing in front of that shelf with their hat in their hands, not laughing anymore. I have been a ranger at Valles Caldera National Preserve for 19 years. Before that I worked fire crews in the Gila, and I thought I understood what wild country was. I did not. The caldera is not wild in the way a forest is wild. It is a bowl, a collapsed volcano more than 13 miles across, and standing at the rim you can see the entire floor of it laid out below you, like the inside of a cupped palm. Grass the color of old brass. Domes of black rock pushed up through the middle where the mountain tried to rebuild itself and gave up. Ponderosa on the slopes, then spruce and fir where the elevation climbs past 9,000 feet, then nothing but wind. People come here for the elk. In the fall we get 2,000 of them down on that grass, and the bulls bugle at dusk, and the sound rolls around inside the bowl and comes back at you from a direction the animal is not standing in. Visitors love that. They record it on their phones. They do not think about what it means that this landscape can take a voice, carry it around the rim, and hand it back to you wrong. I think about it constantly now. The autumn I want to tell you about started the way every autumn starts here. Frost on the truck windows by the second week of September. Aspen going yellow in the drainages. The gate crew putting up the seasonal closure signs on the eastern roads. I was running the North District, which is mostly high country, the timbered ridges that climb toward Redondo Peak and the long cold meadows that drain into them. It is quiet country. It is supposed to be quiet country. The first thing that was not right came in as a routine call from Stephen Harris, who ran maintenance and fence crew and had run it for 11 years. Stephen was 53. Built like a man who had spent his whole life lifting things that were slightly too heavy, and he had exactly one mode of speech, which was flat. He did not do drama. He did not do jokes. When Stephen came over the radio and said he needed me to come look at something and could not explain it, I put the truck in gear before he finished the sentence. He was on the boundary fence at the northeast corner, where the preserve line runs against Forest Service ground. He had a spool of wire on the tailgate, and he had not touched it. He was standing about 30 feet off the fence with his arms crossed, looking at a shape in the grass. It was a bull elk. 6 by 6, maybe 700 pounds live weight, and it was intact. That was the first wrong thing. Nothing had eaten it. No coyote work, no bird work. And this animal had been down long enough that the grass under it had gone yellow and flat. The second wrong thing was how it was lying. It was on its back, with all 4 legs folded up against its body, like a dog sleeping in a house, and its head was turned all the way around so that its chin rested between its own shoulder blades. The neck was not broken open. There was no tearing. Whatever had turned that head had turned it the way you turn a lid on a jar, slowly, with steady pressure, until it went past where it should have stopped. Around the animal, in a ring maybe 12 feet across, the grass had been pressed flat in a circle, not trampled, pressed, as though something heavy had walked that circle over and over in the same track, until the stems lay down and stayed down. "How long has it been here?" I said. 4 days, Stephen said. "I drove this line Monday. It was not here Monday. Nothing has been at it. Nothing has been at it." He said it the same way he would say a fence post was rotten. "That is what I wanted you to see, not the neck. The neck is bad, but nothing has been at it. And we have got bears up here." He was right, and that was the part that sat in my stomach on the drive back. A dead elk on this preserve in September is a public event. Every scavenger inside of 5 miles knows within hours. Ravens come first, then coyotes, then a bear if there is one working that drainage. 4 days is an impossible amount of time for 700 pounds of meat to lie in open grass in this country and not be touched, unless everything that could touch it had decided not to. I called it in to Stephanie White, who was our law enforcement ranger and who handled dispatch when nobody else could. Stephanie was 40 and had come to us from a district in Montana where she had spent 6 years dealing with poachers who shot from vehicles. She had a very short way of speaking on the radio and a very long way of speaking when the radio was off. "Poaching," she said when she got out to the site. She did not sound like she believed it. "With what?" I said. "There is no wound. There is no blood. You do not twist a bull elk's head around with your hands. Somebody could with a strap and a winch, and then leave the animal." She crouched by the ring of pressed grass and did not answer for a while. Then she said, "Where are the tracks?" That was the question I had been avoiding since Stephen called me out. The ground inside the ring was flattened. The ground outside the ring was undisturbed grass and pine needle duff. There was no drag mark. There was no vehicle track within a quarter mile. Nothing had walked in and nothing had walked out, except that when we went over the ring a second time on our hands and knees, working slowly with the low sun behind us so the shadows would lift anything shallow, Stephanie found 4 impressions in the soft dirt at the base of a clump of bunchgrass. They were elk tracks, cloven deep at the toe, a heavy animal, and the 4th one was not. The 4th one had started as an elk track. The crescent was there, pressed in clean, but the back half of it had spread out and gone wide and long, and there were 5 splayed marks running off the end of it, and the middle mark was the longest. It was a hand coming out of a hoof, or a hoof going into a hand, and I could not tell which direction the change was traveling. Stephanie stared at it for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and photographed it, and then she did something I had never seen her do in 6 years of working with her. She stood up, walked to the ring, and scuffed the print out with her boot until there was nothing left but broken dirt. "Why did you do that?" I said. "Because Andrew starts night patrols on Thursday," she said, "and Andrew is 32 years old and thinks he is bulletproof, and I do not want him seeing that." I did not argue with her. I have thought about that decision every single day since, and I still do not know whether she was right. What I do know is that scuffing out a track does not unmake the thing that left it. It only means that when the thing comes back, you have one less way of proving to yourself that you are not imagining it. We drove out at last light. At the north gate I got out to swing the pipe barrier closed, and I looked up at the equipment shed and thought about the coffee can on the shelf, and for the first time in 19 years I actually wanted to know what was in it. Behind me, out on the grass, an elk bugled. It started right. It rose the way it is supposed to rise, that thin, high whistle climbing out of a chest big enough to hold a person. And then at the top, where the note should have broken into those flat, grunting chuckles that bulls make, it did not break. It kept climbing, and it turned into a laugh. Kimberly Sanchez ran the elk study. She was 46, a wildlife biologist out of Las Cruces, and she had been counting animals on this preserve for 9 years with a patience I have never been able to imitate. Her whole professional life was a spreadsheet of calf ratios and winter mortality. She thought in numbers. She trusted numbers the way other people trust family, which is why it mattered so much when her numbers stopped working. She came into the North District office on a Tuesday morning with a laptop under her arm and a look on her face that I did not like. She set the laptop on the counter, opened it, and turned it toward me without saying hello. "Tell me what is wrong with this herd count," she said. It was a spreadsheet of aerial survey data going back 6 years. I am not a numbers person. I looked at it politely and shrugged. "The animals are gone," she said. "Not dead. Gone. I have 311 fewer elk on the caldera floor than I had in the same week last year, and I have no carcasses to account for them, and I have no evidence of movement out through the corridors. They did not die here, and they did not leave here. They are simply not here. Could they be pushed up into the timber?" "That is what I assumed," she scrolled. "So I moved cameras, 22 units, north half of the preserve, up in the spruce and along the drainages where they would go if something on the floor was pushing them. I have 4 weeks of data, and they are up there." She looked at me. "All of them, packed into the north timber at a density I have never recorded on this preserve. They are standing in country with no forage and no water access at 3 times the normal concentration, and they are not moving out onto the grass at dusk. They are not feeding. Some of them are not even bedding. I have got animals on camera, standing in the same position for 6 hours." I did not say anything for a moment. "Elk hide from wolves," she said. "We do not have wolves. Elk hide from people during hunt season. We do not have a hunt in that unit. Elk crowd against a fence line during fire. There has been no fire. She closed the laptop. Animals do not do this. There is no line in 9 years of my data where animals do this. What are they hiding from? That is the wrong question, Kimberly said. They are not hiding. If they were hiding, they would be still and quiet, and they would break and run when something came close. Watch them on the footage. They are not still, they are watching. Every single one of them is facing the same direction and watching, all night, and the direction changes. She opened the laptop again and played me a clip. It was infrared, that flat gray look. Time-stamped at 2 in the morning. 9 elk in the frame standing among spruce trunks. Every animal was oriented to the left of the frame with its ears forward. For 40 seconds nothing happened. Then, all 9 at once, in the same instant, with no sound and no warning and no visible cause, they turned their heads to the right. Not one of them startled. Not one of them stepped. They turned like a single organism. What made them do that? I said. Nothing entered the frame, Kimberly said. I checked audio. There is no audio spike. Whatever moved past that camera moved past it without triggering it. And it moved from the left side to the right side. And it took 40 seconds to cross about 60 feet of open timber. That is slow. That is very slow, she agreed. That is the speed of something that is not in a hurry, in country full of prey animals that it is not bothering to hunt. We watched the clip 4 more times. The 5th time, I saw it, at the far left edge of the frame, in the last 2 seconds before the elk turned. There was a vertical line between 2 spruce trunks that had not been there in the first frame. It was thin. It was slightly brighter than the trees on either side of it, which meant it was warm. It was roughly 7 feet tall, and it did not have a shape I could name. And then in the next frame it was gone, and it did not reappear on the right side of the shot at all. I have run this footage 4 times, Kimberly said quietly. Every clip where the herd reorients, there is one of those. Never in focus, never fully in frame, always at the edge. Have you sent this to anybody? To whom? She said. And there was something bitter in it. I am a researcher for a federal preserve. I submit findings. If I submit this, I do not get an investigation. I get a very kind conversation about my workload. That afternoon I drove up to check the camera she had pulled the clip from. It was strapped to a spruce on a bench above Rito de los Indios, a good spot, wide sight lines through the trunks. I stood where the vertical shape had been and looked back at the lens. The ground there was needle duff, springy and soft. Nothing holds a print in duff, but 60 feet along, where the shape would have gone if it had continued in a straight line. There was a downed log across the game trail, and the bark on top of that log had been rubbed off in 2 places, side by side, about 18 inches apart, like something had stepped up onto the log with both feet at once and stood there. The rub marks were not hooves. Hooves score the wood. These were smooth, broad, and slightly greasy to the touch, and when I brought my fingers back to my face, they smelled like a wet dog that had been dead a long time. I want to be precise about the next part, because this is where I stopped being a man with a strange problem and started being a man in trouble. I straightened up, and I said, out loud, to nobody, "What are you?" And the timber said it back to me. Not an echo. An echo comes back thinner, and it comes back from the direction you sent it. This came from behind me, downslope, maybe 40 yards, and it came back in my own voice with my own cadence and my own slight roughness from a cold I had been carrying for a week. And it did not sound like a question. It sounded like a man reading a sentence off a card in a language he did not speak. I did not run. I have thought about that a lot. I did not run because some very old part of my brain understood, faster than the thinking part, that running would be the same as offering. I walked back to the truck. I did not turn around. It took me 11 minutes to cover ground I had crossed in 6 on the way in, because I made myself walk the entire distance, and the whole way I could hear it moving parallel to me in the trees, keeping pace, staying downslope, never once stepping on anything that would make noise except when it wanted me to hear it. When I reached the truck, I got in and closed the door and sat with both hands on the wheel. Out in the trees, in my voice it said, "What are you?" Then it said it again, a little better. Then it said it a 3rd time, and by the 3rd time it was perfect, and I understood that it had not been mocking me. It had been practicing. Rebecca Ramirez was 62 years old and lived in a house south of the preserve boundary that her grandfather had built out of railroad ties and stone. She was not an employee. She was on our contact list because her family had run cattle on this land for 4 generations before it became a preserve, and because when a fence broke on the south end she usually knew about it before we did. I had known her for 19 years. In all that time we had spoken about weather, cattle, water rights, and one long conversation about her late husband's truck. We had never spoken about anything else, and I had never once been inside her house. She let me in that evening without asking why I had come. Her kitchen smelled like juniper smoke. There was a wood stove going even though it was not cold enough to need one, and there was a shallow dish of ash on the windowsill above the sink. And when I saw it I felt the floor of my stomach drop, because it was the same gray as what was in that coffee can at the north gate. She poured coffee. She sat down across from me. She looked at my face for a while. "You are not sleeping," she said. "No." When did it start? I had come there with a whole careful speech prepared. Something about wildlife behavior and predator displacement and unusual carcass presentation, and every word of it went out of my head. What I said instead was, "It has my voice." Rebecca did not react. That was the worst part. A person who thinks you are unwell reacts. A person who thinks you are joking reacts. She simply sat there with her hands around her cup and let the sentence exist in the room. And then she got up and closed the kitchen window even though the night was warm. "Do not say anything else about it in here after the sun is down," she said. "Not tonight. Come back tomorrow at noon and I will talk to you in daylight in the yard." "Rebecca, you came to my house," she said, "which means you already know it is not a bear, and it is not a person, and it is not something you can write in a report. You do not need me to tell you what it is. You need me to tell you what to do. And I am not going to say the first thing out loud in this house at night, because it learns names, and I have a granddaughter asleep upstairs." I came back at noon. She was in the yard with a wheelbarrow, and she did not stop working while she talked. And I understood that this was deliberate, that speaking of it while doing something ordinary was itself a kind of protection. What she told me, "I am going to give you the way she gave it to me," because she was very careful about the order. She said that there is a kind of thing in this country that used to be a person. She said the how of it does not matter, and is not any of my business, and is not any of hers either, and that people who go looking for the how are the people it takes first. She said it wears animals, not the shape of an animal, not a costume, the animal itself, and that is why the elk lie down wrong afterward, because a body that has been worn does not go back together the way it came apart. She said the rules were these: do not speak its name, and do not go looking for what the name is. Do not answer to your own name after the sun goes down unless you can see the mouth that said it. Do not look into its eyes, because that is the doorway, and the doorway works both directions. Do not tell it anything true about yourself, including with your body. Do not walk your normal walk. Do not use your normal route home. If it uses the voice of someone you love, you do not go, and you do not answer, and you do not weep where it can hear you, because grief is a very loud sound, and it is a sound it can follow. And the last one, which she said twice, if it lets you see it, that is not a mistake. It does not make mistakes with what it shows you. If you see it clearly, it means it has decided you are already inside the fence, and at that point the rules stop being protection and start being manners. What do I do then? I said. Then you make it not worth the trouble, Rebecca said. It is old, and it is patient, and it is enormously vain, and the one thing it will not do is stay somewhere it has been made ridiculous. Ash on the sill, salt on the track, say the ordinary words, do the ordinary work. Be so boring that it goes and finds a house with better crying in it. I laughed. I could not help it. It was the first time in 3 weeks that anything had been funny. Rebecca did not laugh. That is what my grandmother did, she said. It worked. It took 11 months and it worked, and she did not come out of it the same person, and she never once in her life sat with her back to a window again. So laugh if you want, but you asked. If you have made it this far into what happened out there, do me a favor before we go on. Leave a like on this video, and tell me down in the comments what you would have done standing in that woman's yard at noon, listening to a list of rules for surviving something you did not believe in an hour earlier. And if you want the rest of what came out of that autumn, subscribe, because I am not finished with this one. Here is what I did with Rebecca's rules. I wrote them down on a card and put the card in my chest pocket. And then I went back to work, and I did not tell a single person on my crew about them. And that is the choice I would give anything to take back. Because Andrew Clark started his solo night rotation 4 days later. Andrew Clark was 32, and he was good. I want that on the record, because of what people said later. He had come to us from a seasonal position at Bandelier, and he had the thing you cannot teach, which is that he actually looked at country instead of just moving through it. He noticed when a culvert was silting up. He noticed when a visitor was lying to him. He had a habit of narrating his patrol out loud into the radio in a dry-running commentary that drove Stephanie crazy and that everybody else on the district secretly listened for, because it meant somebody was awake out there in the middle of the bowl at 3 in the morning, and you were not alone in the world. His first solo night was a Thursday. Clear sky, no moon to speak of, temperature down to 28 by midnight. He was running the interior road that crosses the caldera floor and then climbs the north side toward the timber. I was at home, 40 minutes off the preserve, with the radio on the counter, because I could not make myself turn it off. At 11:40 he checked in normally. At 12:15 he said, "Got a cow elk standing in the road at the second cattle guard. She is not moving off. I will give her a minute." At 12:19 he said, "She is still not moving off. I am going to bump the horn." Then nothing for 6 minutes. Then he said, in a voice that was completely different from the voice he had been using all night, "It is not standing on the road." Stephanie came up on the channel. She had been listening too. She said, "Say again, Andrew," he said. "It is standing over the road. Its legs are on both sides of the cattle guard. That is a 14-foot span." I was already putting my boots on. Stephanie said, "Andrew, back your vehicle up. Do not turn around. Back straight up the way you came, and stay on this channel." He said, "Copy," and then he said, "It is putting its head down to look in the windshield," and then he stopped talking for 11 minutes. I have listened to that recording more times than is good for a person. There is no scream on it. There is no crash. What there is, at the 4-minute mark, is the sound of a vehicle horn being pressed, held for about 2 seconds, and released, and then pressed again, and then a third time, and the third press is longer, and underneath it, faint. At the very bottom of the audio, there is something that sounds like a big animal breathing through a wet mouth close to a microphone. At 11 minutes he came back on and said, in a perfectly calm voice, "Disregard. It was a cow elk. She moved off. I am continuing north," Stephanie said. "Andrew, what is your location?" he said. "I am continuing north," she said. "That is not what I asked you," he said. "I am continuing north," a third time, in exactly the same tone, with exactly the same spacing between the words. And Stephanie White, who is the most level person I have ever worked with, said later that the hair on her arms stood up so fast it hurt. We found his truck at 4 in the morning at the top of the north road where the pavement ends. Engine off, keys in it, driver door standing open, radio on the seat, his hat on the dash. Andrew was sitting on the tailgate with his hands on his knees, looking out at the timber. And when the headlights hit him, he turned and squinted and said, "Hey, sorry, I think I fell asleep." He was fine. That is the thing nobody believes when I tell it. He was completely fine. He was cold and embarrassed, and he apologized about 9 times, and he passed every question we put to him, and he remembered the elk at the cattle guard as an ordinary elk at an ordinary cattle guard. Stephanie took him off nights anyway. 2 days later, Stephen Harris and his fence crew were pulling old wire out of the northeast corner, in the same section where we had found the bull. There were 4 of them working the line, and Stephen had them spread out about 80 yards apart. Around 2 in the afternoon, in full sun, on open ground, one of the crew, a young man named Ruiz, came over the hill at a dead run with his gloves still on, and got into the truck and shut the door, and would not get back out. What he said, once Stephen got him talking, was this. He had been rolling wire. He had heard Stephen call his name from up the fence line. He had looked up and seen Stephen standing at the top of the rise about 100 yards off, waving him up with one arm. So he had started walking. And as he walked, he said, the figure kept waving. Not the way a person waves, which is a few motions and then a stop. It waved continuously, the same arc, the same speed, the entire time he was walking, for 2 solid minutes, like a machine, and when he got to about 40 yards, he could see that the arm was going too high. It was going up past the ear, all the way up, and coming back down past the hip, and no shoulder joint on a living person does that at that speed for that long. He had stopped. He had said, "Stephen," and the figure had said "Stephen" back to him, in Ruiz's own voice. And then it had put the arm down and walked backward into the tree line without turning around, and its knees had bent the wrong way to do it. At the moment this was happening, Stephen Harris was on the far side of the hill with 2 other men, in radio contact, 800 yards away. Stephen called me directly. He did not use the radio. He said, "I have got a man who will not work this section. I have got 2 more who heard him tell it, and now they will not work it either. I need you to give me something I can write on a form." "There is nothing I can give you," I said. There was a long pause. Stephen was not a man who paused. "My grandmother was from Chinla," he said finally. "I know what my crew thinks it is. I need you to tell me whether I am supposed to think that too." I did not answer him for a long moment. And that long moment was the answer, and he heard it. "All right," he said. "I am pulling the crew off the north half. I will tell the superintendent it is a scheduling issue." Meanwhile, Kimberly Sanchez had done the thing I had been afraid she would do. She had gone back out and collected the bull, not the whole animal. She had taken tissue, and she had taken the head, and she had run a necropsy in the equipment bay with a headlamp and a cordless saw, and no help, because she was a researcher, and this was data, and she was not built to leave data lying in a field. She called me at 10 at night, and I could hear that she had been crying, which, in 9 years, I had never heard. "The cervical vertebrae are intact," she said. "Every one of them. No fracture, no dislocation. The ligaments are stretched but not torn." "That is not possible." "It is not possible," she agreed. "You cannot rotate a cervical column 360 degrees without separating something, unless the separation happened and then went back." "Went back." "There is scarring," Kimberly said. "Microscopic, all along the joint capsules, consistent with tearing and healing, on an animal that has been dead for 2 weeks." She took a breath that shook. "Whatever came out of this animal put it back together on the way out. Badly. Like somebody folding a map they do not know how to fold." I told her to stop working. I told her to leave the bay and go home. She said she had one more thing. She said that when she had opened the thoracic cavity, the heart was gone, not removed. There was no incision and no tearing, and the pericardium was closed and intact. There was simply nothing inside it. Mark Thompson was 65, and he had been volunteering on this preserve since the year it was established. Before that, he had worked the ranch that stood here when it was private land. He had ridden every drainage in the caldera on horseback. If you unrolled a map on the hood of a truck, Mark could put his finger on a spring that was not printed on it. He came into the office the morning after Kimberly called me. He had heard everything, because there is no such thing as a secret on a preserve with 14 employees, and he sat down across from my desk and took his hat off and set it on his knee, which was how he indicated that he was about to be difficult. "You are handling this wrong," he said. "I am open to suggestions." "You are treating it like weather," Mark said. "Something that happens to you. It is not weather, it is a guest. And you have got a whole crew out there behaving like frightened stock, and it is feeding on that. And every day you let it go on, it gets fatter, and it gets braver, and it gets closer to the gate. Rebecca Ramirez says the answer is to be boring." Mark's face changed at that. He had known Rebecca for 40 years. "Rebecca is right," he said slowly. "But being boring is not the same as being quiet. My father knew a man who lost a whole winter to one of these. What ended it was not silence. It was that the man kept his routine so completely that there was nothing left for the thing to eat. He got up, he fed, he mended, he ate his supper at 6. He said his prayers out loud at the door. He did not once, in 5 months, let it change one single thing about his day. And it left. It left." Mark put his hat back on. "But he had a house and a fence and one job. You have got 89,000 acres and a staff and a radio channel it can listen to. Your routine is 100 routines. You cannot hold all of them." He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to go up the North Road tonight," he said. "No, I am a volunteer," Mark said, with enormous mildness. "You cannot schedule me and you cannot unschedule me. I have been on that mountain since before you were born, and it does not know me, and I would like to keep it that way. But I have got a granddaughter who works the visitor center on weekends, and I am not going to sit at my kitchen table for another week hoping this resolves itself." "What exactly do you think you are going to do?" "Walk the road," Mark said. "Same road I have walked for 30 years, at the same speed, whistling the same thing I always whistle. And if it wants to look at an old man doing exactly what an old man has always done, it can look, and it will find out there is nothing in me it has any use for." I told him no 4 different ways. He listened to all of them politely. Then he went anyway, at dusk, on foot, from the north gate, with a walking stick and a hand light he did not turn on. I followed him at a distance in the truck with the headlights off and the window down, running on parking lights, staying 800 yards back, because I could not stop him and I could not leave him alone. The first hour was nothing. He walked. I crawled along behind him. The cold came down out of the timber the way it does in that country, all at once, like a door opening. At the second cattle guard, the one where Andrew had stopped, Mark halted. I stopped the truck. He stood there for a long time. Then he did something that I did not expect, and that I still do not fully understand. He took off his hat, and he held it against his chest, and he said, loudly and clearly, into the empty road ahead of him, "Good evening. I am walking through. I am not stopping." And then he put his hat back on and kept walking. Nothing answered. But about a minute later, up in the timber on the right, something started walking parallel to him. I could hear it from 800 yards away in a closed truck cab. It was not trying to be quiet. It sounded like a horse moving through deadfall, that heavy irregular crashing, except that horses do not go silent for exactly 4 steps and then start again. Mark did not look up. He did not change pace. He started whistling. He whistled for 25 minutes without stopping, the same 8 or 9 bars over and over, some old thing I did not recognize. And the crashing in the timber kept pace with him the entire way, and twice it got close enough to the road edge that I saw the young aspen move. At the switchback where the road turns up toward the ridge, it came out. I am going to describe this once and then I am not going to describe it again. It came out of the trees about 60 feet ahead of Mark and stopped in the middle of the road. It was standing on 4 legs, and it was elk from the shoulders back, a cow, thin in the flank, wet-looking. The front of it was wrong. The 4 legs were too long, and they were jointed in 2 places, and the joints were facing the wrong way, and the neck came up out of the shoulders at an angle no animal uses, and the head was down low and turned sideways so that one eye could look along the road. The eye caught my parking lights from 800 yards, and it came back gold, and it did not blink for the entire time it was in the road, which was a little over 4 minutes. Mark Thompson kept whistling. He kept whistling and he kept walking, and when he was 20 feet from it, he moved to the left side of the road, the way you move around a parked vehicle, and he walked past it. He did not look at it. He did not stop whistling. He went by close enough that he could have reached out and put a hand on its shoulder. It turned its head to follow him. That was all it did. He walked 40 more yards. Then he stopped, and he half turned, and he called back over his shoulder in the most ordinary voice in the world, "There is a gate at the top. I will close it behind me." And then the thing in the road made a sound. I have no way to write this sound. It was not a bugle, and it was not a bark, and it was not a word. It was the sound of something enormously old being spoken to as though it were a neighbor, and being unable to decide whether that was an insult, and it was the closest thing to confusion I have ever heard come out of a living throat. Then it went off the road on the downhill side, and the timber took it, and the sound of it going was still audible when I finally got the truck moving. I picked Mark up at the top gate. He got in and closed the door, and sat with his stick between his knees, and his hands were shaking so hard that the stick was tapping against the dash, and his face was completely calm. "That is how you do it," he said. "That is exactly how you do it. And I am never going to do it again, and neither should you." Andrew Clark went missing on the 9th of November. He had been back on day rotation for 3 weeks, and he had been fine. And that word keeps coming up in this account, and I want you to notice how thin it is. Fine means that nothing was visibly wrong. It does not mean nothing was wrong. He signed out of the North District office at 4 in the afternoon on a Sunday. His truck was found the next morning at the visitor center, parked correctly between the lines, locked, with his phone in the cup holder and his jacket folded on the passenger seat. We ran a search for 6 days, We had 200 people on it by the third day. We had aircraft, we had dogs, and the dogs are the part one need to tell you about, because the dogs would not work the north half. They would work the caldera floor, they would work the south drainages. The moment a handler brought a dog past the second cattle guard, that dog sat down, and it did not whine and it did not bark. It simply sat down in the road and looked at its handler and would not be moved. 4 different dogs, 4 different handlers, same line on the map, within about 200 feet, every time. On the 4th night, at 11:40, the radio in my truck said, "Got a cow elk standing in the road at the second cattle guard. She is not moving off. I will give her a minute." It was Andrew's voice. It was Andrew's exact voice. And I checked afterward, and it was word for word the transmission he had made 6 weeks earlier, and it came through on our repeater at full strength. Stephanie White was in the command post at the north gate when it came through. She keyed her mic and she said, "Say your call sign," and the radio said, "Steph, my leg is broken. I am so cold. Please come get me." Every person in that command post stood up. Stephanie did not move. She sat with the microphone in her hand and her jaw set and the muscle jumping in her cheek, and she said, "Say your call sign," and it said, "Steph, please." She put the microphone down. Then she reached over and turned the repeater off, and she said, "To a room with 9 people in it. Nobody goes up that road tonight. Nobody. If you go up that road tonight, I will have you arrested at the bottom of it." There was a man from a county search team who argued with her. He argued loudly, and he was not wrong to argue, because everything he had ever been trained to do said that a hurt man was on that mountain calling for help, and Stephanie let him say all of it. Then she said, "He called me Steph. In 4 years, that man has never once called me anything but ma'am on an open channel. Not once. He thought it was funny." The room went quiet. That is the part that gets me, still. Not the voice. The voice was very good. The voice was nearly perfect. But it had been listening to us for months, and it had learned the sounds, and it had never once understood what any of them meant, and in the end it was undone by a joke between 2 people about how to address a colleague on the radio. Rebecca Ramirez was right. It is vain. It thinks the outside of a thing is the whole thing. We did not find Andrew. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these accounts usually end, and I am not going to give you that. We suspended the search on day 6. The case is still open. The official finding is that he left his vehicle at the visitor center and went into the backcountry on foot for reasons that could not be determined. I have his card in my chest pocket next to Rebecca's card. I have carried both for 4 years. Here is what happened after. The first hard snow came on the 14th of November, and it came the way it comes in the Gemmas, 16 inches in a night. And it shut the north road until March, and it stopped. All of it stopped. The elk came back down onto the caldera floor in December in a single night. 300 and some animals walking out of the north timber and spreading across the grass like water, finding a low place. And Kimberly Sanchez stood at the rim in the cold with her binoculars and watched them come and did not say anything for a very long time. Her herd count the following spring was normal. Every number back inside the range. 6 years of data, 1 broken season, then normal. Stephen Harris put his crew back on the northeast fence in April, and they rebuilt that section, and nothing happened. Stephen retired 2 years later. He shook my hand at his last day, and he said one sentence to me about it, which was, "I still do not drive that road after dark," and then he talked about his boat. Mark Thompson stopped volunteering, not right away. He came back in the spring and did 3 seasons more, and then he simply stopped signing up, and when I called him he said he had gotten old, which was true and was not the reason. He is still alive. I see him at the feed store. We talk about the weather and about his granddaughter, who no longer works at the visitor center, and neither of us has ever once mentioned that road. Rebecca Ramirez died in her sleep the winter before last. Her family found the dish of ash on the windowsill, still there, still fresh, and her daughter did not know what it was for and threw it out, and I have never been able to bring myself to tell her. Stephanie White transferred to a unit in northern Idaho 18 months after. She said it was for the promotion. She sent me a text on the anniversary the first year, and it said only, "You would not believe how quiet it is here," and I did not answer it, because I did not know how. And me, I am still here. 19 years became 23. I still run the North District. I still swing that pipe barrier closed at the north gate at the end of a late shift, and I still look up at the shelf in the equipment shed at that coffee can with the red tape on the lid. I know what is in it now, Rebecca told me. That afternoon in her yard, at noon, while she moved gravel from one place to another with a wheelbarrow, wood ash, rock salt, and a handful of dirt from the last place a person was seen, which she said was not protection, exactly. She said it was a way of telling the thing that we had counted, that we knew the number, that whatever it took from us was going to be written down and remembered by name, and that this preserve was a place where losses got recorded, and that there is a certain kind of appetite that finds bookkeeping unbearable. I have added to that can once. In November 4 years ago, with a paper cup of dirt from a parking space between two white lines at the visitor center. Now I will tell you the last thing, and then I am finished. 2 winters ago I was closing the north gate on a Tuesday evening around 6. The sun was gone. There was a little snow moving. I had the barrier halfway across when somebody said my name from the other side of the fence, out in the grass, maybe 50 feet off. It was my own voice. It was not a rough copy anymore. It was not a machine reading a card. It said my name the way I say my name when I am tired at the end of a long shift, with the small downward turn at the end that I did not know I had until I heard something else do it. And it said, "It is cold. Let me in." I did not look up. I finished swinging the barrier. I dropped the pin. I put the padlock through the hasp, and I turned the key and I checked it twice, the way I check it every single time, because that is the routine and the routine is the whole defense. Then I said, out loud, in a completely ordinary voice, the way you speak to a stranger in a parking lot, "Gate is closed at 6. It reopens at 7 in the morning." And I got in my truck and I drove home at the speed limit, and I made supper, and I ate it at the table with the radio on, and I went to bed. It has not said my name since, but it is out there, and it has my voice, and it has had 4 years to practice with nothing to do all winter but say my name to itself in an empty stand of spruce until it gets the ending right. So if you are ever driving the interior road at Valles Caldera at dusk, and the elk are out on that brass-colored grass, and one of them bugles and the note climbs and does not break, I want you to do exactly 3 things. Do not stop the vehicle. Do not look for the animal that made the sound, and whatever calls to you from the grass, whatever voice it uses, whoever it sounds like, whatever it says it needs, you keep driving, and you say nothing at all. That is the entire lesson. It cost us a good ranger, an old woman's peace, and 19 years of my belief that the worst thing on a mountain is the weather. If this story got its hooks into you, leave a comment and tell me the exact moment you would have turned that truck around, because I promise you it is not the moment you think. Hit the like button so the algorithm carries this to somebody who needs to hear the rules before they need to use them, and subscribe if you want the next one, because there are 11 more files in the North District cabinet, and I have only opened 4 of them. Stay out of the timber after sundown, and if you hear your own name in your own voice, do not answer it. There is a green metal ammunition box buried under the floorboards of the seasonal quarters at Pinyon Flats, and every word I am about to tell you was written first in pencil on the backs of incident report forms that never reached the filing cabinet. I put that box there myself on the 11th of November, and I nailed the boards back down over it, and I have not lifted them since. I could tell you the exact number of steps from the door to the spot where it lies. Some nights, when the wind comes down off the Sangre de Cristo range and pushes sand against the window like a hand testing the glass, I count those steps in my head until I fall asleep. 9 seasons I worked the sand. Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, in the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado, is a place that does not make sense the first time you see it. You drive across 80 miles of flat, pale grassland with the mountains standing on the horizon like a wall, and then the ground in front of the wall simply rises. 750 feet of it. 30 square miles of dune field piled against the base of a 14,000-foot range, built over 400,000 years by wind that never truly stops. Star Dune, High Dune, Hidden Dune, Medano Creek pouring out of the mountains in the spring and vanishing into the sand by July as if something underneath had swallowed it. Most visitors see the dunes and nothing else. They sled the first ridge, they burn their feet, they drive home. The preserve is the other half, the part nobody photographs. Above the sand, the land climbs into aspen and spruce, into Medano Pass and Music Pass and the long, lonely stretch of the sand ramp trail that runs 11 miles between the dune field and the mountain, through country where you can walk all day and see no living thing larger than a horned lark. That trail was mine. Backcountry patrol, 5 campsites, 1 primitive road, and a radio that only worked when the terrain agreed to allow it. I am telling you this so you understand that I was not a visitor. I knew that ground the way you know the inside of your own mouth. I knew which drainages held water in a dry September. I knew where the elk crossed and where they never crossed and why. When I say that what I found on the 19th of October did not belong to any animal in North America, I am not guessing. It started as a routine call. A vehicle had been sitting in the point of no return lot for 2 nights. Colorado plates, a dust-colored sedan, a sunshade folded neatly in the back seat. No permit on the dash. Stephen Harris ran the registration from the district office and gave me a name that meant nothing to me. A man in his 50s out of Pueblo who had told his sister he was going to walk up Medano Pass Primitive Road and photograph the aspens. Andrew Clark rode with me that morning. He was 32, in his 2nd season, still at the stage where every call felt like it might be the one that mattered. He kept his hat squared and his boots clean, and he asked more questions in a day than most people ask in a year. I liked him for it. There is a kind of seasonal ranger who treats the job as a summer of scenery, and there is the other kind, the one who reads the trail like scripture, and Andrew was the second kind. We started at the vehicle and worked outward. The road was frozen in the shade and thawing in the sun, which is the best tracking surface God ever made. We picked up boot prints inside the first 200 yards, size 11, worn on the outside heel, a common enough hiking pattern. He had gone up the road, and then, at the second creek crossing, he had left it. That was the first thing that did not sit right. There is no reason to leave the road there. The terrain to the north is a mess of willow and deadfall and loose cobble. It goes nowhere. But his prints went into it, and they went in a straight line, and the stride was long. Running. He had been running. We followed for 1.5 miles. The ground rose. The prints crossed a game trail and did not slow at the crossing, which is unnatural, because a person running through brush will always break stride when the footing changes. His did not. And about 1/2 mile past that game trail, we found the other set. Andrew saw it first. He went very quiet, which for him was remarkable, and he crouched down and put his hand flat beside the impression without touching it. Elk. Or something making elk tracks. A large one, by the size, walking in the same direction, overlaying the boot prints in places, which meant it had come through after him. That was not strange in itself. The elk herd in that country is close to 3,000 animals, and they use everything. What was strange was the place, about 400 yards on, where the hoof prints stopped. They did not fade out. They did not turn onto rock. They stopped in soft sand at the base of a low bank. 4 prints clustered together the way an animal stands when it is holding still. And then, 12 inches in front of them, there were 2 bare human footprints facing the same direction. Nothing between. No transition. No disturbance in the sand around them. As if the animal had stood there and then a man had stood there instead, in the same breath, in the same square yard of ground. The human prints were long and narrow, and the toes had dug in deep. The way toes dig in when a person is leaning forward to move fast. They went on for perhaps 60 feet. Then they stopped as well. And there were hoof prints again beyond them, and the hoof prints climbed the bank at an angle no elk would attempt with a bank that loose. Andrew looked up at me and waited for me to say something reasonable. That is what a 2nd-season ranger does. He waits for the 9-season ranger to name the thing so it can go back into the box of understood phenomena. I said we were going to photograph it and cast it and mark the coordinates. We did. I have the photographs. They are in the metal box under the floor at Pinon Flats, along with everything else. We never found the man from Pueblo that day. We searched until the light left the valley, and the light leaves that valley all at once, in about 11 minutes, as if a hand is closing. On the walk back to the truck, I felt the particular pressure on the back of my neck that anybody who has spent long enough alone in wild country will recognize. I turned once. There was a ridge behind us, a low one, maybe 200 yards, crowned with a few stunted pinyon and a lot of open sky. Something was standing on it. upright, tall enough that I could see the shoulders against the last of the light, and thin enough that the shoulders looked wrong on the body, like a coat hanger left inside a shirt. It did not move while I looked at it. It did not move when I raised my binoculars, and by the time I had them focused there was only canyon and sky. But I had already smelled it. The wind had turned and brought it down to us, and it was the smell of an animal that has been dead about 4 days in warm weather, mixed with something sweet, like the inside of a fruit that has gone over. Andrew smelled it too. He did not say anything. He just walked a little faster, and so did I. And neither of us mentioned that we were walking faster. The report I filed said unresolved. Stephen Harris read it in the district office, with his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at me for a while. Stephen was 53, and had been law enforcement in 3 parks before this one. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a fool. But he had built his whole career on the principle that every mystery is a paperwork problem that has not been solved yet. He asked me if I was suggesting that a person had made those prints barefoot in 30-degree weather. I said I was suggesting nothing. I was reporting what was on the ground. He asked me if I understood how that would look to the regional office. I said I did. He filed it. To his credit, he filed it exactly as I wrote it. And that is a thing I have thought about often in the years since, because it means that somewhere in a government archive there is a document describing what we found, and it will outlive everyone involved. The next morning I drove down to the Zapata side to talk to Rebecca Ramirez. Rebecca was 62 and ran cattle on leased ground south of the park boundary, which meant that she and I had a professional relationship built entirely on fence lines and elk damage. She was the kind of person who could tell you the age of a track by the way the edges had crumbled. She had grown up in that valley, and her family had been in it since before there was a park to be a boundary of. She had lost 4 animals in 11 days. She took me out to see the last one. It was a young cow, and it was lying in a stand of rabbit brush about 40 yards off her water tank, and there was almost no blood on the ground. The hide had been opened along the belly in a single continuous line, not torn, opened. The organs had been removed and set aside in a neat arrangement on the dirt, and they had not been eaten, and no coyote or magpie had touched them in what must have been at least a day and a night. There were no tracks around the animal. Not hers, not a predator, not a vehicle. The ground was soft and it held my boot prints beautifully while I stood there, and it held nothing else at all. Rebecca did not offer any theory. She stood with her arms folded and let me look. And when I was done, she said one thing. She said that her grandmother had told her that when the animals start being taken this way, you do not go out at night, and you do not answer your own name if it is called from outside the house. I asked her what she thought was doing it. She said she was not going to say it out loud on her own land. That afternoon I went to the visitor center to pull the old incident logs, and that is where I ran into Mark Thompson. Mark was 65, a volunteer, 3 days a week at the front desk. And before that he had spent 40 years working ranches from Saguash down to Antonito. He knew every drainage in the valley by the name that ranchers used for it, rather than the name printed on the map. He was popular with visitors because he told good stories, and he was popular with staff because he brought coffee that was better than ours. I asked him, in the way you ask a question you do not want anyone else to hear, whether he had ever known cattle to be taken the way Rebecca's had been taken. Mark Thompson stopped smiling. That was the whole answer, really, and everything he said afterward was decoration. He asked me where I had been standing when I felt it looking at me. Not whether, where. I told him about the ridge, and the shoulders, and the smell. He took me outside to the sidewalk by the flagpole, away from the building, and he told me 3 things. He told them slowly, like a man handing over tools he did not want to give up. The first thing was that it moves like whatever it is wearing, but never quite correctly, and that the mistake is always in the joints. Watch the elbows, watch the knees. Something that has borrowed a shape has to guess about the hinges. The second thing was that it learns voices. It learns them by listening, and it will use the voice of the person you would most like to hear, and it will use it at the exact moment you are most tired. The third thing was that it cannot come into a place where it has not been invited, but that you invite it every time you answer it. I asked him where he had learned all of this. He said he had learned it in 1978, on a winter range south of Crestone, and that he had been 24 years old and had gone out to check a gate at 2 in the morning because he heard his brother calling him from the corral. I asked him what happened. He said his brother had been dead for 6 years at the time. Then he went back inside and made coffee and told a family from Missouri a very funny story about a marmot. And he did not speak to me about it again for 11 days. If you are still with me at this point, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and leave a comment telling me the name of the wildest place you have ever been alone in after sundown. I read every one of them. It helps me know that somebody out there is listening, which, for reasons that will become obvious, matters to me more than it probably should. The night after I talked to Mark, I drove Medano past Primitive Road on a routine closing patrol. That road is 4-wheel drive only, 9 river crossings, deep sand for the first stretch, and after dark it is one of the loneliest pieces of ground in the state of Colorado. I had done it 200 times. I could drive it with the window down and my elbow out and my mind entirely somewhere else. I was between the 4th and 5th crossing when something started running alongside the truck. It was in the cottonwoods to my right, maybe 30 feet off, and I could not see it, only hear it, and the hearing was enough. It was moving through deadfall at speed without any of the crashing that a big animal makes in deadfall. It was pacing me. I looked at the speedometer because I wanted a number to hold on to later, and the number was 28 miles an hour. I went to 35. It stayed with me. I went to 42, on a road where 42 is genuinely stupid, and the sound stayed exactly level with my door. Then it laughed. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where people stop believing, and I understand why. It was not a laugh the way a person laughs. It was a laugh the way a person who has only ever had a laugh described to them might attempt one. 4 sounds, evenly spaced, at the same pitch, with no breath in between. Then it was gone, and there was only the engine and the river. I did not stop until I was through the gate. Stephanie White was the resource management specialist for the park, and she was 40 years old, and she did not like me very much. That is not entirely fair. She did not dislike me. She disliked the way field rangers treated her instruments, which we did in fact treat badly. And she disliked speculation of any kind, and I had a reputation for speculation, but she was rigorous, and rigor was exactly what I needed. So, on the 24th of October, I went to her office with the photographs and the casts. She looked at the casts for a long time without saying anything. She measured them. She photographed them next to a scale bar. She pulled a reference guide off her shelf and compared the hoof impressions to elk and to horse and to moose, and she agreed that they were elk or something with feet indistinguishable from elk. Then she looked at the human prints, and she asked me, in a very flat voice, whether Andrew or I had made them. I said no. She said that was the answer she expected, and that it was the one she liked least. Stephanie had 11 audio recorders deployed across the preserve as part of a 3-year study on how the elk and the mountain lion population were using the corridor between the dune field and the high country. The units ran on a schedule, an hour on and an hour off, all night, and they had been running since June. Nobody had listened to most of it. There were thousands of hours. She had been feeding it through software that flagged anomalies. She had a folder of flagged files she had not been able to classify. She had been sitting on it for 2 weeks because she did not know what to write in the column marked identification. She played them for me. The first one was an elk bugle. A bull elk in September makes one of the strangest sounds in nature, a rising whistle that breaks into a series of grunts. This was that sound, and it was almost right, and the wrongness of it was very hard to describe. The pitch climbed, and then it kept climbing past where an elk stops, and it held, and it held, and it held for 19 seconds, which is roughly 4 times longer than an animal with lungs can hold it. Then it came down through the grunts, and the grunts were evenly spaced, exactly evenly, like a metronome. The second file was from the Sand Ramp Trail, Unit 7, the 14th of October at 2 in the morning. It was a woman calling for help. 2 words, repeated 11 times over about a minute, with the same intonation each time. Not similar intonation, the same. Stephanie had put the waveforms on top of each other, and they matched to a degree that no human voice can match itself. There had been no woman on the Sand Ramp Trail on the 14th of October. There had been nobody at all. The backcountry permits for that week showed 4 parties, all of them below the creek, All of them accounted for. The third file was the one that made me put my hands on the edge of her desk. It was my voice. It was me calling in a location check to dispatch. My cadence, my particular habit of pausing before the numbers, the slight flatness I get in my vowels when I am tired. It gave a coordinate that does not exist. It gave a unit number that has never been assigned in that park. And underneath it, faintly, was the sound of something breathing at a rate of about 6 breaths a minute, which is the breathing rate of a very large animal at rest. The recorder that captured it was Unit 3, on the bench above Little Medano Creek. On the night in question, I was 40 miles away in Alamosa. I could prove it. I had a receipt. There was a fourth file that she almost did not play, and she told me afterward that she had gone back and forth about it for 3 days. It was 17 minutes long, and it was mostly nothing. Wind across the microphone housing, a pocket gopher working somewhere under the unit, the distant sound of a vehicle on the county road, which carries an extraordinary distance across that valley on a cold night. And then, at the 11-minute mark, counting, a voice counting slowly upward in English, beginning at 1. It was not a voice I recognized. It was not male or female in any way I could settle on. It counted to 47, and then it stopped, and there was a pause of about 9 seconds, and then it began again at 1, and it counted to 47 again, and stopped. Stephanie had checked. There were 47 backcountry permits issued for the preserve that month. She said that was almost certainly coincidence, and that she was noting it only because she noted everything, and I agreed with her out loud that it was coincidence, and I do not think either of us believed it for a second. The thing I could not get past was the patience. Whatever made that sound had lain in the pinyon above Little Medano Creek in the middle of the night, with nobody to hear it and nothing to gain, and practiced counting. Twice. Slowly. Getting it right. Animals do not rehearse. People rehearse when they are preparing to be somewhere they do not belong. Stephanie asked me to leave her office. Not rudely. She just needed the room. 2 days later she came and found me at the maintenance yard, and she had changed. Her hands were not steady. She said she had gone back through the full archive with a filter for that particular breathing signature. It was on 61 nights. Going back to the 4th of July, it had been moving. Early in the summer it had been up high, near Music Pass, at the edge of the study area. By September it was on the Sand Ramp Trail. By the middle of October it was on the units nearest the campground. It was working its way down toward where the people were, one recorder at a time, and it had taken it 4 months to do it. Andrew Clark was the one who noticed the pattern in the human voices. He had been helping Stephanie tag files, which he volunteered for, because he volunteered for everything. He came to me on the 27th, and he was not squared away that day. His shirt was untucked at the back, and he had not shaved, and there was something wrong with the way he was holding his shoulders. He said the voices on the recordings belonged to people who worked in the park. He had identified 4. One was mine. One was Kimberly Sanchez, the search and rescue coordinator out of the county, whose voice is on our radio traffic constantly. One was a maintenance worker who had retired in August. And one was a woman that Andrew said he could not identify, and when I pushed him on it he told me the truth, which was that he could identify her perfectly well. It was his mother. She had died when he was 19. There is no recording of her voice anywhere in the world that he knows of, and there was no way for anything in that valley to have heard it. He asked me what I thought it meant. I did not have an answer, so I gave him the only useful thing I had, which was Mark Thompson's 3rd rule. I told him that, whatever was out there, he was not to answer it. Not with his voice, not with his flashlight, not by turning his head. If something calls you by name in that country, you keep walking. Andrew said he understood. I believe that he did understand. I have thought about it every day since, and I am certain that he understood me completely, and that understanding it made no difference at all. The man from Pueblo was found on the 30th of October. 11 days after his vehicle was first reported. He was found by a family from Nebraska who had hiked up the ridge toward High Dune at first light to take photographs. He was 200 feet below the crest, on the steep leeward face where the sand slides under you, and every step costs 3. He was lying on his back with his arms at his sides. I was second on scene. Kimberly Sanchez was first, because she had been staging a training exercise at the amphitheater lot, and she was closer than any of us. She was 46, 22 years in mountain rescue, and she had recovered more bodies out of that valley than anybody living. She was standing about 15 feet from him when I came over the ridge, and she was not moving, and Kimberly Sanchez was not a woman who stopped moving on a scene. The man had been dead a long time. The dry air and the cold nights had done what dry air and cold nights do. But the sand under him was smooth. Wind moves that dune field constantly. A body lying there for a week and a half is buried, uncovered, buried again. The sand around him showed the fresh ripple pattern of the night wind, unbroken, right up to the edges of him, as if he had been set down that morning. He had not walked there. There is no way to reach that point without leaving a trail of collapse behind you 100 yards long. His boots were on his feet. Both of them were on the wrong feet. That detail is not in the official report. I want to be honest with you about that. It is not in the report, because Stephen Harris and I stood on that ridge and had a quiet conversation about what a report is for. And we agreed that a report is for the family and the coroner and the archive, and that some things do not help any of the three. I have carried that decision for a long time. I am putting it here now because you deserve the whole of it, and because I do not think it can hurt him anymore. The cause of death was recorded as exposure. The medical examiner in Alamosa found no injuries, none at all. Not a scrape, not a fracture, not a mark on him, on a man who had allegedly run 1.5 miles through Willow and Deadfall in the last hours of his life. The search for how he got to that ridge ran for 6 days and found nothing. And on the 4th night of it, we lost radio discipline. Here is what happened. We had teams out on the dune field after dark, which is unusual but not unheard of, because the surface temperature makes daytime work miserable and the sand holds sign better in the cold. Kimberly was running the operation off the ridge above the creek. I had a team of 3 on the north side. At 11:40, Kimberly's voice came over the radio and directed my team to move east into the interdune. The voice was hers. The call sign was correct. The phrasing was correct, including a small verbal habit she has, a way of saying copy that at the end of an instruction. We were 40 seconds into moving east when the real Kimberly came up on the channel and asked who had just transmitted. There was a silence on that radio net that I can still hear. 6 teams, 18 people. Nobody said anything for perhaps 4 seconds, which on an active net is an eternity. Then Kimberly, the real one, told everybody to hold position and give a head count by name, and we did. And everyone was present, and the transmission had come from nowhere. East of us, in the interdune, was a closed depression 1/4 mile across, with slopes on all sides. If we had walked into it in the night, we would have been in a bowl, with our backs to the wall, in the one place on that entire dune field where you cannot see the horizon. We pulled everybody off at midnight. Kimberly made the call herself, and she made it over the objection of the county, and it probably cost her something professionally, and she made it anyway. Stephen Harris came up to the staging area at 1 in the morning. He had been in the office all week, refusing to entertain a single word of any of this. He stood next to me at the tailgate while I logged equipment, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he told me that at 11:10 that night, before the radio call, he had been standing alone by his vehicle at the Pinon Flats entrance, and something had come out of the grass 40 feet away and walked past him. He said it went on 2 legs, and it was about 7 feet tall, and it had the head of a bull elk. He said the antlers were wrong. Too many points, and they came off the skull at an angle that would have broken a real animal's neck. He said it turned and looked at him as it went by, and that its eyes did not reflect the flashlight, and that it moved its arms when it walked, and that the elbows bent the wrong way, backward and then forward, as if it were correcting itself. Stephen Harris was 53 years old and had 26 years in federal law enforcement, and he had never once in his life reported anything he could not defend in a courtroom. He said, and I am giving you his exact words as I remember them, that he wanted somebody to know in case he was not able to say it later. Then he got in his vehicle and drove down to the office and wrote a memo recommending that all night operations in the preserve be suspended for the remainder of the season. And he signed it, and he never explained the reasoning to anyone above him. If this is hitting you the way it hit me, go ahead and drop a like on this one before we go any further. It helps more than you would think. And honestly, after 26 minutes of my worst year, it is nice to know somebody stayed. The patrol cabin below Medano Pass is a single room, 16 feet by 20. Wood stove, propane lantern, 3 bunks, a table, and a door that opens inward. There is a spring house 40 yards away and an outhouse 30 yards in the other direction, and nothing else for 6 miles in any direction. On the 6th of November, Andrew Clark and I went up to close it for the winter. It should have been a 2-hour job. Drain the lines, pull the batteries, board the window, haul out the food, sign the log. We got there at 3 in the afternoon with plenty of light. The truck would not start when we were done. I want to be careful about this too, because I know how convenient it sounds. But I have thought about that truck more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life. And I can tell you that it was a 2011 utility vehicle with 90,000 miles that had never given me a moment of trouble, and that when I turned the key there was nothing, not a click, not a light on the dash, as if the battery had been removed. The battery was there. The terminals were clean and tight. We had no signal. The repeater does not reach into that pocket, which everybody knew, which is why we carried a satellite messenger, and which is why it mattered enormously that the messenger showed a clear sky view and full charge and refused to acquire a position for 2 hours. By the time we accepted that we were staying, the light was going. I want to describe the sound the valley makes at dusk in November, because the absence of it is how we knew. There should be nutcrackers in the pines. There should be a coyote somewhere south around full dark. There should be the small, constant business of a forest that is settling. There was nothing. Not a bird, not an insect. There had been sound at 4 o'clock, and by 5 there was only the creek. And the creek is not a comfort in that situation, because moving water covers everything. We got the stove going. We ate what we had. Andrew was very quiet, and I did most of the talking, which was the reverse of how it usually went. At about 8:30, something knocked on the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, at the height a person would knock. Andrew stood up. I put my hand on his arm and he sat back down, and I watched him understand what I meant, and I watched him decide to trust me, and I have been grateful for that for the rest of my life. We did not answer. At 9, it walked around the cabin. I could hear the pine needles compress under it. The steps were long, and they were bipedal, and they were heavy, and the rhythm was almost human, and every 5th or 6th step there was a small drag, as if it were remembering partway through that this was how the borrowed body was supposed to move. At 9:40, it started talking. It used Kimberly Sanchez first. It said there was a vehicle at the bottom of the road. It said this 4 times with identical inflection. Then it used Stephen Harris, and it asked us to confirm our location. Then it used my voice, and it called Andrew's name from outside the door. And it did it well, and I looked at Andrew, and he looked at me, and neither of us made a sound. And the thing outside said his name 11 more times, and then it said something in a language I did not recognize, quietly, close to the wood. At 11, it stopped, and there were 3 hours of silence that were worse than the talking. At 2 in the morning, it used a woman's voice. Andrew's hands opened on the table. I had never heard the voice before, and I never heard it again, but I knew immediately who it was supposed to be, because Andrew made a sound I have only heard from people at the very worst moment of their lives. It was calling him by a name that was not the one he used, some family name, something small and old. I told him to look at me. I told him it was not her. I told him that the thing outside was doing exactly what Mark Thompson said it would do, at exactly the hour Mark Thompson said it would do it, and that this was proof, and that proof was all we had. He nodded. He was crying, and he nodded, and he stayed in his chair, and I thought we were through it. At around 4, the voice stopped, and I fell asleep. I did not mean to. I had been awake for 22 hours, and the stove was warm, and the human body is a traitor. I woke at 5:50, and the door was standing open, and Andrew was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. His boots were gone. His jacket was gone. His radio was on the table. In the frost outside the door there were his prints, going away from the cabin toward the creek, walking, not running, and even ordinary stride. And beside them, matching him step for step, close enough that the 2 of them must have been touching, were the tracks of a large elk. I followed them for 1.5 miles in the dawn and lost them where the ground went to rock above the spring. And I stood there and shouted his name until I could not shout anymore, which I know was the exact thing I had told him never to do, and I did it anyway, because he was 32 years old, and he was mine to bring back. Nothing answered. Then something did. from 3 ridges over, in my own voice, and it was calling my name. I walked out, 16 miles down the primitive road. I did not run, because Mark had never said anything about running, but I had a very strong feeling about it, and I have learned to trust those feelings. Twice I heard something moving parallel to me in the timber, and both times I kept my eyes forward and my pace even. I reached the gate at 4 in the afternoon, and Kimberly Sanchez was there with 2 vehicles because the truck had come up as overdue at noon. She took one look at my face and did not ask a single question until I was sitting down with water in my hand. Andrew Clark was found on the 9th of November, 3 days later, walking on the county road 11 miles south of the park boundary. He was barefoot. He was wearing his uniform trousers and his undershirt and nothing else, and it had been 18 degrees the night before, and he had no frostbite. None. Not on his hands, not on his ears, not on the soles of his feet, which were clean. He knew his name. He knew the year. He knew Kimberly, and he knew Stephanie, and when I came into the room at the hospital in Alamosa, he looked at me and he smiled, and he said hello, and he used my first name, which he had never once done in 2 seasons of working together. He had no memory of the cabin. He had no memory of the search, or of the recordings, or of his mother's voice. He remembered the sedan in the parking lot in October, and then, he said, it was the road. The medical staff found nothing. He was dehydrated in a way that did not match 3 days without water. His blood work came back with a note about kidney values that his physician described as inconsistent with the history. He was released after 2 nights. He came back to work in the spring. Here is the part that I have never been able to make anyone understand, and I am not sure I can make you understand it either. So I will just tell you the small things and let you decide. He got the joints wrong, not dramatically. Andrew Clark walked and sat and reached for a coffee cup the way any man does. But if you had known him before, and I had, you would notice that when he climbed into the passenger seat of a truck he led with the wrong leg. That when he was tired he put his elbow on the table with the arm turned slightly too far. That when he sat still for a long time his knees would drift outward past where a person is comfortable, and he would leave them there for minutes at a stretch, and then he would notice and correct. He stopped asking questions. 2 full seasons of the most curious young man I ever worked with. And after that November, he never once asked me anything about the job. He was warm. He was polite. Visitors liked him better than they had before. He was promoted the following year, and every so often, when he thought he was alone, I would hear him practicing. That is the only word for it, standing at the back of the maintenance shed with his hands loose, going through the motion of a laugh. 4 sounds, evenly spaced, at the same pitch, with no breath in between. Over and over, a little closer each time. Stephanie White transferred to a park in the upper Midwest at the end of that fiscal year. Before she left, she gave me a hard drive with 61 nights of audio on it and asked me to keep it somewhere she did not know about. She said that she had spent her entire career building a career on the principle that anything that exists can be measured, and that she was not going to be the person who published this, and that she was not going to be the person who deleted it either. She has not answered a message from me since 2018. Stephen Harris retired 8 months early. His memo suspending night operations was quietly rescinded after he left, and as far as I know, nobody ever asked him why he wrote it. Rebecca Ramirez sold her lease in the spring and moved to Pueblo to be near her daughter. She lost 11 animals in total. She never once said the word to me, and I never once asked her to. Kimberly Sanchez is still working. She is in her 60s now, and she still runs mountain rescue in that county, and she is very good at it. And she has never mentioned the radio call, and I have never mentioned it to her. And on the 2 occasions when we have found ourselves alone at a staging area at night, we have both, without discussing it, kept our backs to the same wall. Mark Thompson died in the winter of 2019, at home, at 81, which is a better ending than most of us get. 2 weeks before he passed, I drove down to see him and I told him everything, about the cabin, about the door, about Andrew. He listened all the way through without interrupting. Then he told me the 4th thing, the one he had not given me on the sidewalk by the flagpole, because he said a person can only carry 3 at a time. He said that the reason it takes them is not hunger. He said hunger would be a mercy, because hunger ends. He said it takes them because it is learning, and that a shape is easy, and a voice is harder, and a whole life is the hardest thing of all, and that it will keep the ones it takes for as long as they are useful, and then it will let them go, hollowed out, so that it can start on somebody new. He asked me whether Andrew had ever come back to being curious. I said no. He said that was because curiosity is the part it eats first. I put the box under the floor at Pinyon Flats in November of that year. The photographs, the casts, the pencil notes on the backs of incident forms, the copy of the audio, the coordinates. It is all there. I nailed the boards down and I painted over the nail heads, and I went back to work for 4 more seasons, and then I put in my papers. I have not been back to the San Luis Valley since 2021. I live somewhere flat now, in a place with streetlights, where you can see a person coming for a quarter mile. I still do not answer to my name at night. My wife thinks it is a joke between us. She will call from the other room and I will wait for her to say it twice, because that is the rule I made, and the rule has held for 6 years. Last month I got a message from a seasonal ranger I have never met. He found my name in an old logbook. He said they were doing floor repairs in the seasonal quarters at Pinyon Flats. He said they found something under the boards, and he wanted to ask me about it. I have not written back yet. If you made it all the way through this one, subscribe so you catch what happens if I do answer him, and tell me in the comments whether you think I should. And if a voice you love calls you from outside tonight, from a place it has no business being, do the thing I did not teach Andrew Clark well enough. Do not answer. Do not turn around. Just keep walking, and keep the fire going, and wait for the sun. There is one form for a body that comes home, and a different form for a body that does not. And after 19 years of government service, I can tell you that the second one is shorter. That has always bothered me. You would think the paperwork would swell to match the size of the hole a person leaves. Instead, it shrinks. Name, date of last contact, last known coordinates, weather conditions at time of loss, signature of the reporting officer, and then a human being becomes a filing number in a cabinet in a modular office in southern Colorado, and the wind keeps sliding sand over the exact square of ground where they were standing when the world stopped counting them. I am putting this down because there is no box on that form for what actually happened, and because I have started to understand that I am not going to be the one who explains it to anyone official. I have tried twice. Both times the words came out of me sounding like a man describing a dream he had while running a fever. So this is the other version. The one I would tell you if you were sitting across the table from me at the diner in Hooper, with the coffee going cold between us and the sun going down behind the Sangre de Cristos. I work the backcountry district at Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, 44 square miles of dune field with the tallest sand in North America, stacked up against a wall of mountains. And behind that dune field another 100,000 acres of creek bottom, aspen, spruce, alpine tundra, and country that nobody visits because there is no easy way in and no reason to go. Most people who come here never leave the first mile. They take their photographs at the base of High Dune. They let their children run barefoot in Medano Creek in June. They buy a magnet, and they drive on toward Alamosa. That is fine. That is what the front country is for. My district is what is behind it. Medano Pass Primitive Road, the Sand Ramp Trail, the 7 backcountry camps strung along the edge where sand meets timber, and the drainages above them that hold water in the spring and hold nothing at all by the middle of August. I patrol it in a truck with 300,000 miles on it and on foot when the sand takes the road. I have pulled 11 people out of that country alive. I have pulled 2 out who were not. This started on the 9th of October at 11:40 in the morning with a radio call from Ethan Diaz. Ethan was 39 that fall and in his second season with us, which made him old for a seasonal and young for the way he carried himself. He had come out of 8 years doing trail crew in the Gila, and he had the forearms to prove it. He was steady on the radio. He did not editorialize. When Ethan called something in, you took it at face value. And that is why the sound of his voice that morning stayed with me the way it did. He said he had a dead elk on the Sand Ramp Trail, roughly a half-mile north of the Little Medano crossing. Cow elk, mature. He said the animal had been skinned. I asked him to confirm. Poaching happens. It is not common here because the terrain punishes you for trying. But it happens, and when it happens the pattern is always the same. They take the meat. They take the back straps and the hindquarters and whatever they can carry to a vehicle before the light goes, and they leave the hide in a heap because a hide is heavy and worth almost nothing and takes real work to make into anything. Ethan came back and said no. He said the meat was still on the bone. He said the hide was gone. I got there at 1:20 in the afternoon. I remember because I logged it, and I remember because I have looked at that log entry more times than any sane man should. The elk was lying on her left side in a shallow scoop of sand at the base of a stand of ponderosa, and she was perfect. That is the word I keep coming back to. Perfect. She had been opened along the belly and along the inside of each leg, and the hide had come off her in one piece, and there was not a single cut on the muscle underneath. I have field-dressed animals. I have watched people who have done it for 50 years field-dress animals. Nobody is that clean. You leave marks. The blade skips, it catches, it takes a divot out of the meat when you are tired, or the angle is bad. There were no marks at all. The muscle underneath was smooth and red and glossy like something you would see behind glass. There was almost no blood. The ravens had not come. That was the part Ethan kept circling back to, and he was right too. It was the 9th of October in an open pine stand with a 200-pound carcass lying in the sun, and there was not one bird on it, and not one magpie in the trees, and no coyote sign anywhere in that sand. The flies were the ordinary kind, and there were not many of them. Everything that should have been feasting was somewhere else. We photographed it. We measured it. We looked for a drag mark, a boot print, an ATV track, a horse track, anything that would let me write the word poaching in a report and go home. What we found instead was a line of elk prints coming down out of the timber toward the carcass. Ordinary cloven prints, sunk deep in soft sand, the way a heavy animal walks when it is not in a hurry. 9 feet from the body, the prints changed. I want to be careful here because I know what this sounds like. I am going to describe exactly what was in the sand and nothing more. For 4 strides, the tracks were elk. Then for the next 3 there were only 2 of them, side by side, spaced like a walking man, and each one still had the split hoof and the dewclaw pressed in behind it. Then they were elk again on the other side of the body, going up the slope toward the dune field, and they held that line until the sand got firm and stopped taking impressions at all. Ethan asked me what could do that. I told him a hoax could do that, because that was the only sentence available to me. Somebody with a set of carved wooden hooves and a great deal of free time and a strange sense of humor. He asked me why a person would haul a set of carved hooves 9 miles up a trail with no road access to prank 2 rangers who might not walk past for a week. I did not have an answer then. I have one now, and I would trade it back if I could. I called it in to Yasmin Hayes. Yasmin was 51, our chief of resource management, and she had been at the park 11 years longer than I had. She grew up in the valley. Her mother taught school in Center. Yasmin is the most careful person I have ever worked with, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. She does not guess. She does not fill silence. When I described the carcass over the radio, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked me one question that had nothing to do with anything I had just said. She asked me whether the hide had been taken toward the mountains or toward the dunes. I told her the tracks went toward the dunes. She was quiet again. Then she told me to document everything, to collect a tissue sample, to leave the animal where it lay, and to be off that trail before sundown. Not sunset, sundown. She said it in a way that made it an instruction rather than a suggestion. And Yasmin had never once in 11 years told me when to be off a trail. We got back to the trucks at 6:15. The sun was already behind the ridge and the dune field had gone that color it goes in October, a kind of bruised gold that makes the whole 30 square miles look like something poured rather than piled. There was a wind coming down off the pass, and if you have never heard it, the sand here makes a sound when the conditions are right. It is a real phenomenon, and there is a real explanation for it. Grains of a certain size shearing across each other in a certain kind of avalanche, and it comes out as a low droning hum that you feel in your sternum more than you hear in your ears. Booming sand. Tourists love it. It has been documented here for 200 years. I mention it because that hum was going the whole time we were loading gear, and I mention it because it means I was already listening to something, already tuned in, when the radio in my truck came alive. It was Ethan's voice, clear. No static, he said. I am still up here. I turned around. Ethan Diaz was standing 4 feet behind me with a Pelican case in both hands and his radio clipped to his chest, and his mouth was closed, and he was looking at the speaker in my truck with an expression I have not been able to get out of my head in all the time since. What came over the radio? Neither of us said anything for a while. That is the honest part. There is a version of this where I keyed my mic and demanded identification and started a professional radio protocol investigation, and that version would make me sound like somebody worth listening to. What actually happened is that 2 grown men stood in a parking area at the base of a mountain range and looked at a radio and waited to see whether it would do it again. It did not that evening. I ran the traffic up the chain anyway. We share frequencies with the county and with the Forest Service, and it is not unheard of for a signal to bounce or for somebody on a bootleg handheld to key up and say something stupid. I asked dispatch to pull the log. Dispatch pulled the log. There was no transmission recorded at 1816 on our repeater. Nothing was logged because nothing came through the repeater. Whatever pushed that voice into my truck was close enough to reach my radio directly, and my radio has a range of about a mile on simplex in that terrain. Ethan asked me not to put the incident in the written report. I told him I had to. He said, "Put down that I keyed up by accident." I said no. He did not push it, but he was quiet on the drive down, and when we got to the housing area he sat in the passenger seat a while after I shut the engine off. He told me his daughter was 7. He told me she lived with her mother in Silver City and he got her for a month in the summer and every other Christmas. Then he said, "If that thing can do my voice, it can do hers." I told him it was a coincidence and a bad night. I want to be clear that I knew I was lying while the words were coming out of my mouth. The next morning I went to see Henry Coleman. Henry was 58 and he ran 200 head on a permit that ties into the preserve side above Medano Pass, which means that legally speaking he was a stakeholder, and practically speaking, he was the only person alive who knew that country better than I did. His family has been in the San Luis Valley since before the valley was in a state. His grandmother was from Blanca. His grandfather came up from New Mexico with a string of horses in 1922 and never went back down. Henry had a face like a piece of tack leather and the driest sense of humor of any man I have known, and he had never once, in the 14 years I had known him, been unwilling to talk. I described the elk to him at his kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee going cold in front of me. He stopped being willing to talk about halfway through. I know what that looks like on a person. It is not fear exactly. Fear is loud. This was a man closing doors inside himself one at a time, and by the time I got to the part about the tracks changing, he was looking at the window over the sink instead of at me. He said, "Do not tell me any more of that in my house." I asked him what he meant. He said, "You are bringing it in with you when you say it." I sat there. Henry got up and rinsed his cup and stood with his back to me and his hands on the edge of the counter for what felt like a long while. And then he gave me the only thing he ever gave me, and I have followed it ever since, and I am going to give it to you in the same shape he gave it to me. He said there are rules, and the rules are not complicated. Do not say what it is out loud. Not the word for it. Not in the daytime, not as a joke, not to prove you are not afraid. Do not answer when it calls you. It will use a voice you love. That is the whole trick. That is the entire trick, and it works every single time, because people are built to answer the ones they love. Do not look at it for long. Look at where it is standing, not at it, and do not let it in. It cannot come through a door it was not invited through. But it is patient, and it is very good at getting people to open things. I asked him whether he believed all that. He said belief did not have anything to do with it. He said his grandfather did not believe in the weather either. He said, "The weather does not care." Then he told me to get out of his kitchen, and he said it kindly, and I went. That afternoon I called Olivia Bennett. Olivia was 37, and she was a wildlife specialist working a 3-year study on mule deer movement corridors between the preserve and the Baca Refuge. She had 41 trail cameras out across our unit and the adjacent land, and she was the only person in the valley who had a passive record of everything that had walked through that country for the last 19 months. She was sharp, and she was blunt, and she had absolutely no patience for anything that could not be measured, which is exactly why I wanted her involved. I wanted somebody to tell me I was wrong. I asked her to pull every card within 3 miles of the carcass site. She called me back at 10 at night, which was the first sign, because Olivia kept farmer's hours and had told me more than once that nothing in the field is urgent enough to lose sleep over. She had 4 things. The first was a mule deer buck on camera 19, taken 11 days before the elk, walking past the lens at 2 in the morning. Ordinary animal, ordinary gait. The next frame in the sequence, 4 seconds later, showed the same buck with its head turned all the way back over its own spine to face the camera directly. Not turned like an animal looks behind itself. Turned past the stop. She said the neck was at an angle that would require the vertebrae to have come apart. The second was camera 22, which had a 9-minute gap in a timestamp sequence that is not physically capable of gaps because it fires on a fixed interval as well as on motion. The third was camera 31, and this is the one that made her call me at 10 at night. The camera had been mounted on a ponderosa at chest height, aimed north up a game trail. In the final image on the card, the camera was aimed at the ground 11 feet below it, and the mounting strap was intact, and the tree in the frame was a different tree. The fourth thing was not an image, it was an inventory. Olivia had gone out that day and physically located every one of her 41 cameras, because she is thorough in a way that borders on unpleasant, and she found all 41, and 11 of them had been moved, not damaged, not stolen. Moved, remounted, restrapped, and re-aimed, and every one of the 11 was now pointing at the same place. They were pointing at the ring of willows along Medano Creek, about 2 miles north of the point of no return, in a spot with no trail and no reason. Olivia is not a person who says things she cannot support. What she said to me on the phone that night was this. She said, "Somebody is running an experiment on us, and they have better field skills than either of us, and I would like that to be the answer. And I do not think it is the answer." I told her I would go look at the willows in the morning. She said, "Do not go alone. If you are still with me this far in, do me a small favor before we go into that creek bottom together. Because what is down there is where this stops being strange and starts being something else." Tap the like button. And if you have your own story from country like this, put it in the comments, because I read every one of them. And if you want to hear the rest of what happened in that valley, subscribe, because there is more of it than I have told anybody. Now let me tell you about the willows. The ring in the willows. I did not go alone. I took George Foster. George was 45 and he ran facilities, which at a park our size means he ran everything that was not a person or an animal. Water systems, vault toilets, the grader, the culverts, the 12 miles of primitive road that Medano Creek eats every spring. He had been here 17 years. He was a large, slow-moving, extremely calm man who had once spent 4 hours under a truck in a snowstorm and come out the other side complaining about the sandwich he had brought. I took him because he had a chainsaw and a temperament, and because I did not want to take Ethan Diaz anywhere near that country until I knew what was in it. We went in on the 16th of October, on foot, up the creek bottom from the point of no return. It is a hard walk. The sand there is deep and loose, and it takes the strength out of you through the ankles, and the willows grow in a tangle that will strip a hat off your head if you are not paying attention. Above the willows the mountain comes up fast, spruce and rock, and to the west the dune field rises like a wall of nothing. We found it at 10:50 in the morning. There was a clearing in the willows about 60 feet across that had no business being there. Willows do not leave clearings. Willows fill everything they can reach. This one had been made, and it had been made a long time ago, because the cut stems around the edge had healed over and grown into thick, knuckled stumps, the way a plant does when it has been cut back season after season for years. In the middle of it there was a ring of stakes. The stakes were juniper, sharpened, driven deep, and the ring was not a circle. It was closer to an oval, and it was flattened on one side. And I counted the stakes twice, and got the same number both times. And that number was 32. On the stakes there were hides. I want to describe this correctly, because when I say it fast it sounds like something out of a film. It was not dramatic. That was the worst part. It was tidy. Every hide had been stretched between 2 stakes and laced along the edges with cord and left to weather, the way a person might dry hides they intended to use, except that nobody had ever used them. They had been left. They had been left for years. There were 16 of them. The oldest were on the north side, and they were barely hides at all anymore, gone gray and stiff and papery. the hair worn away and the shape of the animal only just readable in the outline. The next ones were browner and had hair on them in patches. Then they got better and better as you went around the ring, and the freshest was on the southeast side, and it was a cow elk, and the hair still lay flat and clean and the inside was still faintly pink. That one was 7 days old. I knew exactly how old it was. George stood at the edge of the clearing and did not come in. I want that on the record. He is not a superstitious man, and he did not say anything about spirits or curses or any of it. What he said was, "That is a graveyard, and I am not going to walk around in a graveyard." I went in. I photographed all 16. I logged coordinates. I sampled 3 of them, and then I looked down at the sand inside the ring, and I stopped being able to hear George talking behind me. There were boot prints in there, not a scuffle of prints, not somebody wandering. There was one clean set that came in from the west side of the ring, walked the entire inside circumference of it in a single unbroken loop, stopped at the fresh elk hide, stood there long enough to sink in half an inch deeper than the walking prints, and then went back out the way it came. They were Danner Mountain Lights, size 11, with the outside heel worn down on the right foot, because of the way I have walked since a truck rolled on my ankle in 2014. They were mine. I put my own boot into one of them, and it filled it exactly, right down to the notch in the tread where I picked up a piece of rebar in the maintenance yard in August, and never got around to caring about it. I had never been in that clearing before that morning. I want to say that as plainly as I know how. I had never been in it. I had never seen it. I did not know it existed, and there was no reason for any patrol of mine to have taken me there, because there is no trail, no camp, no water source that matters, and no visitor has any business in that tangle. I stood there and did arithmetic. Sand holds a print for a long time in a sheltered creek bottom with no rain, and there had been no rain since the 28th of September, but the edges of those prints were crisp. They were not weeks old. I asked George to come look. He looked from where he was standing. He did not come in. He said, "Whose are those?" And I said, "Mine." And he said, "That is not funny." And I said, "No, it is not." We went out. I did not sleep that night, and I did not sleep well again for a long time after. The thing about a find like that is that it stops being your problem the moment you write it down. 16 animal hides staked in a ring on federal land is a wildlife crime scene. And a wildlife crime scene is not resource management, and it is not backcountry, it is law enforcement. And that meant Sophia Jenkins. Sophia was 34, and she had come to us in June from Big Bend after 4 years there and 3 before that in the Everglades. Commissioned protection ranger, defensive tactics instructor, the kind of person who has a bag in her vehicle for every category of emergency and knows exactly where each of them is. She had a way of listening that made you want to be more precise than you were being. I liked her enormously, and I think she found me slow. She read my report. She looked at the photographs. Then she came and sat in my office and asked me a series of questions in order, and every question was a good one. Did the site have vehicle access? No. Was there a route in that avoided all 7 backcountry camps? Yes, up the creek. Had anyone with a special use permit or a research permit been working that drainage? No. Did the healed willow stumps indicate the site had been maintained for at least a decade? Yes. Did I have any explanation whatsoever for my own boot prints inside the ring? I told her the truth, which is that I did not, and that the only explanations I could think of were worse than having none. She said, "I have one. Somebody made a mold. Somebody with access to the housing area and access to my boots and enough patience to press a copy into the sand so I would doubt myself." She said it was a technique. She said she had seen stranger things done to intimidate a witness. I asked her who. She said, "That is the part we work out." Then she said the sentence that started the last part of this. She said, "I want to sit on it." Yasmin Hayes said no. I was in that meeting. Yasmin said no twice, and she said it in a way I had never heard from her. And when Sophia asked her for an operational reason, Yasmin could not give one. She said, "I have a bad feeling about that drainage." Coming from Yasmin Hayes, that was an extraordinary thing to say out loud in a government building, and I watched Sophia decide, politely and completely, that it was not a reason. Sophia had the commission. Yasmin had the resource authority. Those two things do not resolve cleanly, and everybody in that room knew it. We went in on the 21st of October. 3 of us, Sophia, Ethan, and me. Yasmin walked me to my truck before we left. She had a paper bag in her hand, and she gave it to me and said, "Do not open this in front of them." I opened it later. It was a small bundle of ash bark and juniper wrapped in wool, and a note in her handwriting that said only, "Do not answer. I want you to understand that Yasmin Hayes has 2 graduate degrees, has published on aeolian sediment transport, and once corrected a visiting delegation on their own data in front of their own leadership. She also grew up in the valley. That is the part everybody forgets, the long count. We set the camp 400 yards south of the ring, on a bench above the creek where the willows thin out and you can see a good distance in 3 directions. Sophia chose the site, and it was the right site. High ground, escape route, line of sight, no cover for anyone approaching from the north. She set up a camera on a tripod with a thermal scope beside it. Ethan built a fire ring and then, on Sophia's instruction, did not light it. The last of the sun came off the top of the dune field at about 6:20, and the temperature fell off a cliff the way it does in October at 8,000 feet. 29 degrees by 9. Clear sky. Almost no moon, and the stars over that valley are the kind that make people who grew up in cities go quiet. Nothing happened for 4 hours. I want to be fair to the night and say that. 4 hours of nothing but Ethan asking Sophia about Big Bend, and Sophia asking me why anybody would stay 19 years at one park, and the creek making the sound a creek makes when it is running under the sand in some places and over it in others. At 1:17 in the morning, the coyotes stopped. There had been a pack working the flats to the south all evening, going the way they do. That sound people who do not know it mistake for a dozen animals when it is 4. They stopped mid-chorus. Not tapering off. Stopped, the way a radio stops. Ethan said, "What was that?" Sophia said, "They got interested in something." We sat in that silence for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because Sophia was calling out the time every few minutes in a low voice for the record, a discipline I have kept permanently since. At 1:28, something walked into the willows on the north side of the clearing. We could hear it. Willows are a good alarm system. Nothing gets through them quietly. Not a bear, not an elk, not a man. This thing did not try to be quiet. It came in at a steady walking pace, and it kept that pace absolutely even, and it went around the outside of our camp in a circle at a distance of about 80 yards. Sophia had the thermal up. She scanned it again. Then she handed it to me without a word, and I put my eye to it and swept the willow line where the sound was. And the sound was there and moving, and I could hear the stems breaking, and there was nothing on the thermal. Ambient, cold willows, and colder ground, and one warm smear low down, that was a rabbit. I gave it back to her. Neither of us said anything to Ethan. It went around us 4 times. Then it stopped on the south side, between us and the way out, and it did not move for a long while. At 2:06, it started talking. The first voice was a woman calling for help, not screaming. That is what people get wrong. It was the tired, hoarse, faintly embarrassed voice of somebody who has been calling a while and has started to feel foolish about it. She said she had come off the sand ramp trail and lost her light, and she thought her ankle was broken. She said she could see our camp. There was no camp to see. We had no fire and no lamps. Ethan started to get up. Sophia put a hand flat on his chest and did not take it off. The voice went on for maybe 6 minutes, and then it stopped in the middle of a word. The second voice was Ethan's daughter. I did not know it was his daughter until I looked at him. She was calling him Papa. She was saying it the way a small child says a thing when she is half asleep and wants somebody to come, over and over with no urgency in it at all. And that lack of urgency was the most obscene thing I have ever heard in my life. It was so ordinary. It was so exactly like a real 7-year-old girl in a real bed in a real house in Silver City, New Mexico. Ethan Diaz made a sound I am not going to describe. Sophia had both hands on him by then, and I had his radio and his sidearm because Sophia told me to take them, and the 3 of us sat on that bench in the cold and let a child's voice call for her father out of a willow thicket for what the log says was 19 minutes. Then it stopped. Then it used my father's voice. My father died in 2022, in March, in a hospital bed in Pueblo, and he did not go easily, and I was not there for the last part of it because of a road closure on Highway 50 and a decision I made about a shift I could have handed off. That is a thing I carry. It is mine, and I have never told it to anybody at that park. He said my name the way he said it. He said it the way he said it when I was small and had done something and he was not angry yet. That lifting note at the end. And then he said, "I waited for you. I would like to tell you that I sat still because I am strong. That is not true. I sat still because Yasmin Hayes put a paper bag in my hand, and because Henry Coleman told me the rules in his kitchen, and because those two things were louder in my head at that moment than my own father was." I did not answer. It said it 4 more times, spaced out, patient, each time a little closer. Then it stopped, and I heard it walk away north through the willows at that same even pace. The last thing it did was the worst. At 3:41, from a long way off, out somewhere near the ring, it counted. Slowly, in a voice that was not any voice I recognized, it counted from 1 to 3. Then it stopped. Then, after a pause, it said 3 again. "There were 3 of us on that bench," Sophia said. "That is enough. We walk out at first light." At 4:22 she left the camp. She told me she was going down to the creek to fill a bottle. She took her light and her sidearm, and she did not take her pack, which is the detail that ended every argument later about whether she meant to come back. Nobody walks away from a pack in October at 8,000 feet, unless they are coming back. She was 30 yards out when she said, "Hey." She said it the way you say it to somebody you have just recognized. Warm. A little surprised. Then she said a name. I could not hear which name. Then there was nothing at all. No scream, no shot, no sound of running. The night simply closed back over the place where her voice had been, like water over a dropped stone. Ethan and I searched with lights until the sun came up, which was reckless, and I would do it again. We found her at 7:10. Not her. Her boots. They were in a cottonwood on the far side of the creek, wedged into a fork about 40 feet up, laced together at the tops the way you would sling them over a shoulder. The tree had no branches below 22 feet. I measured it later, because measuring things is what I have instead of a way to feel better. There were no tracks under that tree. None. Not hers, not anybody's, not an animal's, in sand that will take a print from a chipmunk. Her socks were still inside the boots, and they had been folded. What walked out of the dune field? A missing commissioned ranger is not a local event. By 2 in the afternoon on the 22nd we had incident command stood up in the maintenance bay. A helicopter out of Alamosa, 2 dog teams driving up from Pueblo, county deputies, our own people, Forest Service people, and 41 volunteers who signed in at a folding table where George Foster wrote every name down in a notebook because the tablet would not hold a signal. I have run searches. I have taught the classes. There is a rhythm to a search, and the rhythm is the only thing that keeps 100 people from turning into a mob. And that rhythm is built on the assumption that the missing person is somewhere, moving in a way a person moves, leaving the sign a person leaves. Nothing we did worked. The dogs would not go up the creek. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not me making the story better. 2 certified air-scent dogs with a combined 19 years of operational experience refused the drainage above the point of no return. The first one lay down in the sand and would not be moved, and her handler carried her back to the truck. The second would not get out of the vehicle at all. Her handler stood there apologizing to me like the animal had insulted my family, and I told him it was fine, and he said, "This has never happened," and I said, "I know." The helicopter flew 4 sorties and found nothing, which is not unusual in willow and timber. What was unusual is that on the 3rd sortie the crew reported a person standing in the open on the eastern edge of the dune field, waving. They gave a position. It was a 9-minute flight to a landing zone, and 11 minutes on the ground on foot for the team already staged at the Castle Creek picnic area. When they got there they found no person, and no tracks in open sand under a 100-foot dune face that had been photographed from the air 14 minutes earlier, with a person clearly visible on it. I have the photograph. I have looked at it more than I should. The figure in it is standing wrong. That is the only way I can put it. The proportions are ordinary and the posture is not. On the second night, Ethan Diaz answered. He was on a hasty team with 2 volunteers, working a grid on the timber side. Both volunteers gave the same statement afterward, and neither of them knew each other. They said that at around 10 at night they heard a woman calling in the trees to the north, and that she was saying, "Help me," and that she sounded close, and that Ethan Diaz stopped and turned toward it and said, "Sophia," just her name. Once, they said the calling stopped immediately. They said Ethan stood there for maybe 15 seconds and then said, "We should keep moving," and that the rest of the sweep was normal, and that he did not mention it again. Ethan came off shift at midnight. He came and found me at the incident post, and he sat down on an overturned bucket and he said, I answered it. I told him it did not mean anything. I told him he was tired. He said, "You know it means something." And I did not say anything back. And that silence is one of the worst things I have ever done to another person. Olivia Bennett arrived on the third day with her cameras. She had gone out on her own, without asking anyone, and pulled and redeployed 22 units in a ring around the search area at a 2-mile radius, which is a piece of work that should have taken 3 days and which she did in about 30 hours with a headlamp and a company truck. She brought me the cards herself. She did not talk about spirits. She talked about pattern. She had 19 months of baseline data from that unit, and she had done the arithmetic. Over those 19 months, there were 41 nights on which every single camera in the entire array recorded no animal activity at all between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning. Not a mouse. Not a moth triggering a sensor. 41 nights of nothing in a system that averages 260 detections a night. She had plotted them. They were not random and they were not weather. They tracked the moon. Every one of those 41 nights fell within 2 days either side of the new moon, and the gaps in the sequence lined up with the 4 months when the road is closed by snow and nobody at all is up there. She said, "Whatever this is, it is a resident." She said, "It lives here and it has a season and it has a schedule and I can predict it, and that is the part that I cannot deal with." She quit the study 11 days later and moved to Oregon. We still exchange messages at Christmas. She has never once mentioned any of it. Sophia Jenkins came back on the 4th day. She walked out of the dune field at 4:50 in the afternoon, on the 25th of October, from the west, from the middle of 30 square miles of open sand where there is no water and no shade, and where the search had flown twice a day for 3 days. She was barefoot. She was wearing the clothes she had walked away in, and they were not torn, and they were not filthy. Her hair was clean. 4 days, no water. Barefoot on sand that runs to 140 degrees at the surface in summer and freezes at night in late October. Her feet were not injured. That is the detail that went into the medical report, and that is the detail I want you to sit with. Not blistered, not cracked, not sunburned. The people who examined her wrote the word unremarkable. She was dehydrated by the numbers, and she showed no symptoms of it. She knew who everybody was. She used first names. She answered questions in order, and her answers were coherent, and she made eye contact, and she was polite to the deputies, and she thanked the volunteers by name as they came past. I stood 11 feet from her for about 2 hours that evening, and I am telling you that there was nothing wrong with her that anybody could write down. Here is what was wrong with her. She never blinked at the wrong time. Everybody blinks at the wrong time. You blink when you are thinking, when you are pausing, when a light changes. She blinked at even intervals, like a metronome, and she blinked when she was not talking and never in the middle of a word. She had learned everybody's names in 4 days that she had spent alone in a dune field. There were 41 volunteers on that search. She had never met one of them, and she stood in the parking area at the visitor center after dusk and asked 4 separate times of 4 separate people whether she could come in and lie down. She was a commissioned ranger with keys to every building on that unit. She had a residence 100 yards away and a code to the door. She stood outside and asked to be let in, and each time somebody said, "Of course," and each time she said, "Say it properly," and the 4th person, a volunteer from Monte Vista who did not know any better, said, "Come in." Yasmin Hayes was standing 11 feet away, and I watched her face when that word was said, and I have never seen anybody look the way she looked. That night Yasmin did something that ended her career. Although it took 2 years to finish killing it. She ordered a full evacuation of the housing area on a fabricated report of a natural gas odor. 9 residences. Everybody out to the hotel in Alamosa at 11 at night. She lied to the incident commander. She lied to the county. And she wrote a report the next week that anybody who cared to read carefully could see was false, and somebody eventually did care. I have never asked her why. I know why. What I do not know, and what I think about most, is what she believed would have happened if all of us had stayed. At 2 in the morning, I was in a hotel corridor, and my phone rang from the duty line at the park. I answered it because it was the duty line. There was a long stretch of nothing, and the sound of wind moving over an open speaker, and then a voice said my name. It was my voice. My own voice, exactly, down to the way I run the syllables together when I am tired, and it did not say anything else. It said my name, and then it waited, and it kept waiting, and I stood in a hotel corridor with my back against a wall and listened to my own voice breathing on the other end of a phone line for 1 minute and 40 seconds by the timer on the call log. Then it hung up. 17. Sophia Jenkins resigned on the 9th of November. There was a process. There is always a process. She underwent a fitness for duty evaluation. She passed it. She completed a debriefing that ran to 14 pages and contains nothing of any value. And then she submitted a 2-sentence letter and left the valley in a rented van on a Tuesday morning without saying goodbye to anybody. I have tried to find her, twice. The forwarding address she gave was a mailbox service in Bernalillo. The phone number is disconnected. Big Bend has no record of her contacting them, and neither does the regional office. There is a woman with her name and roughly her age, with a driver license in another state, and I have looked at the photograph on the public record, and I am not going to tell you what I think about that photograph. Ethan Diaz did not come back for the following season. He wrote to me in February. It was a short message, and mostly it was about a job he had taken doing fence work outside Deming. And then at the end of it he said one thing. He said that his daughter had started talking in her sleep. He said she talks to somebody outside her window. He said his ex-wife thinks it is a phase, he said. I answered it. And I have thought about that every day since. And I would like you to tell me it does not work like that. I wrote back and told him it does not work like that. I do not know whether that is true, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to be right about something. Henry Coleman died in January, in his sleep, at 58, of a heart that his family said had been giving him trouble for years, which was news to everybody who knew him. His daughter cleared out the house that spring. She found, tucked behind the water heater, a coffee can with 41 juniper stakes in it, sharpened, and a hand-drawn map of the Medano drainage with a mark in the willows and a date written next to the mark. And the date was 1991. The ring had been there since before I was hired. It had been there since before Yasmin was hired. Henry knew where it was, and he had known for 34 years, and he had never once told a ranger, and I have thought a great deal about what a man like that is doing when he keeps a thing like that to himself. And the only answer I have is that he was not keeping a secret. He was keeping the peace. George Foster transferred to a park in Ohio in the spring. He asked for it. He had 17 years of seniority and a life here, and a shop he had built out of nothing. And he took a lateral to a unit with no backcountry and 11 miles of paved road, and he has never once responded when I have brought any of it up. Yasmin Hayes was reassigned in the reorganization 2 years later, which is the way that kind of thing is done, and she took an early retirement rather than move. She lives in Alamosa. We have dinner every few months. We talk about her garden. Once, about a year ago, she said one thing about it, out of nowhere, over a plate of enchiladas. She said, "My mother taught in center for 30 years, and she told me 2 things about this valley. She said, do not go up that creek at the new moon. And she said, if it ever learns your name, it does not forget it." Then she asked me whether I wanted more coffee. I still work here. People find that difficult to understand, and I do not have a satisfying answer for them. I am 43 years old, and I have given 19 years to this unit, and I know the water sources and the drainages and where the elk go in November, and there is a version of leaving that would be running, and I have decided not to run. That may be pride. It probably is. I do not go up that creek. That is my one accommodation, but I went up it once more, in April, alone, without telling anybody, which was a violation of about 6 policies, and which I would do again for the same reason a person picks at a scar. The ring was still there. The stakes were still there, 32 of them. There were 17 hides. 16 of them were the ones I photographed on the 16th of October, weathered another 6 months. The fresh elk gone gray and papery like all the rest. as though the whole ring were aging on a schedule that had nothing to do with actual time. The 17th was on the southeast side, in the place where the newest one always goes. It was not an elk. It was not a deer or a bear or a cat or anything else that lives in the state of Colorado. It was stretched between the two stakes the same as the others, laced along the edges the same as the others, and it was about 5 feet 6 inches from end to end, and it had no hair on it anywhere, and it had a shape. I did not photograph it. That is the one professional failure in 19 years that I will not defend and will not apologize for. I walked out of that clearing and I did not stop walking until I hit the road, and I sat in my truck at the point of no return with the engine off for a long time. I have not been back. Here is the reason I told you all of this, instead of putting it in a file. 2 weeks ago, in the small hours, I heard something outside the housing area, out past the fence line where the sand comes up against the yard. It was not calling my name. It was not using my father, or a child, or a lost hiker. It was practicing. It was working through voices, one after another, in the same order every time, quietly, the way somebody rehearses. George, then Olivia, then Ethan, then Yasmin, then Henry Coleman, who has been in the ground for 3 years, then Sophia. And then it did me, my voice, and it got it wrong the first time, and it stopped, and it did it again, and it was closer that time, and it did it a third time, and by the third time I could not have told you it was not a recording of me. Then it said, in my voice. And I want you to understand that it was not asking me anything. It was reading a line it had learned from somebody. It said, I am still up here. That is what Ethan's voice said on my radio on the 9th of October, before any of this started. Which means it had that sentence before it ever met Ethan Diaz. Which means it has been saying that sentence in somebody's voice out there for a very long time. I did not answer. I have never answered, but it does not need me to. It has my voice now. It has had my boots in that ring since before I ever walked into it, and I have stopped trying to work out what that means about the order things happen in out there, because that way of thinking does not lead anywhere a person can live. So I sit up on the new moon with the lights off, and I do not go to the window, and I do not go up the creek, and in the morning I put on the uniform and I go to work. And if a family stops me by the amphitheater to ask about the tallest dune, I tell them it is 750 feet, and I point them at the boardwalk, and I tell them to be back at their car by dusk. They always ask why by dusk. I tell them the sand gets cold,